Here today will be a kind of quick video on finding measures, and then I'm going to have you watch two other videos that I linked you to in the module on test reliability and test validity. So these are important concepts to learn. Some of them are coming from chapter 4 and chapter 5, and that's okay. We'll go back and review them again, and you'll get a chance to solidify those. But right now you need to know them because in terms of constructing your research proposal, we can't wait until chapter 4 and 5 are finished to then go ahead and start selecting measures for your study. And so we talked a little bit about the way that you might begin to construct your introduction. And now we're going to help you in terms of finding a measure. Maybe you still don't really have a great idea or a great sense of how you want to or what you want to study. That's fine. It may be that today is the day that you figure out what you wanted to study because you found a measure that you find interesting. And so this is another way of building a question. You can look at different measures and you start wondering, like, let's say I have a measure of nausea. And so I'm thinking, how many people get nauseous when they are on the elevator versus people who get nauseous on the stairs? That's kind of a dumb question, honestly, but it just came out of my head. So it's an example of saying, oh, this measure of nausea made me think about a study. Now, it may feel like a dumb study, but you could do that study and it would be completely appropriate for designing a research proposal, because the idea, remember, about the research proposal is that you're not doing your favorite thing. You're doing something that you can get done in 6 weeks or 5 weeks or 4 weeks. And so what you're doing is something that will work, something that you can say, okay, this demonstrates that I understand the principles. That's what it demonstrates. So research involves measuring things. Any kind of research is going to involve measuring, whether you're observing something or maybe you're asking a person some questions to find out what's going on inside their head, or you are taking a physiological measurement to understand what's going on in their body. So these are three basic ways of measuring that you can kind of categorize together. Asking people things, what you're doing is trying to find out what's going on inside them, things you can't really measure. Or you can measure them, and so you're watching them to measure them, or you can measure them by looking at their body. Three different ways to measure. If you want to find a measure for your study and you think that this is your chance to now make up a questionnaire, I would like to discourage you from that, because that is generally not a very good method, especially for the purposes of this research paper. You want a measure that has good reliability and validity. This is really important. And if you make up your own measure, your whole study is going to be spent making up your measure and trying to find reliability and validity there. That is a whole different class. That class is a psychometric class. That's really more like graduate school. Don't do that. Instead, find a measure that works for you, and you could build your study around that. Or your study may involve a pretty common construct like anxiety or depression or well-being or anger or some of those things. And then you build the study after finding the measure that works for you. Not having a reliable and valid measure is such a threat to your study's validity, your study's internal validity, that it makes it so that the study is no good. Because if you're not able to reliably measure, you can't, if your measure has no consistency, or if your measure doesn't actually measure what you say it measures, well, then your study doesn't do what you think it's doing. So you can't really do it. So my suggestion, my strong suggestion is find a reliable and valid measure that's already out there. So how do you find a measure? You can simply Google it. You can say measure of anxiety or measure of well-being. That might work. You can look in one of the search engines we discussed yesterday. And so I would add the word measure also, anxiety measures, sleep, how to measure sleep. You could find some things there. You might see a measure mentioned when you look through your topic. That's very, very common. That's an excellent way to choose a measure. Let's say you wanted to look at the impact of chocolate and sleep. And so you start looking at sleep, and you see some ways that people measured sleep in the past. And you might think, oh, I'm going to use that method. I'll use that measurement. You can also look at lists of measures. That might help you come up with a researched idea. So I'll point you to some of those things. Here are some physiological measures to think about. If you type in physiological measure sleep on Google, just do that right now. Pause and go do that. And what you'll see, there are lots and lots of research results, Google results. There are lots of Google results to look through. You can read about this, you can learn about this, spend some time just hanging out and looking for different things. Here again, the difference between finding the right answer and just spending some time hanging out and learning. Okay, right? This is your goal. Hang out and learn, not stress out about finding the right answer. Here are some physiological ideas that would help you measure some things with physiological measures. So you could use these things for a number of different purposes, but these are all physiologically based measures. The first one is called actigraphy. Actigraphy is a really cool device. You can wear it kind of like a watch, and you wear it to bed, and it will measure movement. And using algorithms, it will calculate things like how long did you sleep? What was your quality of sleep? How many times did you wake up in the middle of the night, for example? What was the sleep latency? So that's another word for how long did it take between you laid down in bed and you actually fell asleep, etc. There are a whole number of physiological measures about sleep that actigraphy can give you. So you can look that up and just learn a little bit more about it. If you want to use that to help measure sleep, that might be great. And so if you were going to do that study that we talked about yesterday, looking at dark chocolate versus milk chocolate versus no chocolate, everybody wears an actigraphy, or an actigraph, actually, they call it an actigraph. Everyone wears an actigraph, and you're doing actigraphy. Okay, got it? Everyone wears this actigraph, and then you measure their sleep. You could do that. There's another physiological measure called galvanic skin response, or GSR. GSR measures essentially moisture or sweat on the skin. Very, very small amounts can indicate stress. And so you can get a measure of stress from GSR. That might be really pretty cool. So if you want to have people do something and measure the amount of stress that they're under, you could use GSR to measure that. Let's say they are trying to make their best friend eat chocolate and it's very stressful. You could measure that with GSR to see how stressful it is. Or maybe you want to measure when they're studying math versus when they're studying English. Which one is more stressful for them? Take a GSR measurement, etc. Okay. Blood pressure is another physiological measure. Heart rate or pulse, blood glucose. There are lots of them. And finally, there's something called VO2 max, which is a physiological measure of oxygen transport. And it's more expensive to use VO2 max, but you could look it up on Google and just read about it. It's kind of cool. It will help you see the amount of stamina that you have in terms of your exercise. Here are some questionnaire types of measures. So we just discussed physiological. These are questionnaires. This is where you're giving someone a questionnaire to kind of get inside their head and figure out what they are feeling or thinking. And so there's the STAI. This is a really popular, widely used, reliable, valid questionnaire. It measures state anxiety and trait anxiety. And again, those are two concepts that come from psychology. And if you don't know what they are, Google them. They're kind of interesting. And maybe that would help you build a test or build an experiment looking at state anxiety or trait anxiety, or build an association measure or study. Here's another one, the Beck Depression Inventory. Easy to look all these things up. Just Google them. You should get a ton of information on them because they're so popular. So this is the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI. measures depression, very widely used, very reliable, very valid. When you watch those other 2 videos that I've attached to today, you will really get a great sense of what reliable and valid means and why it is critical. The suffering scales. Well, this is a lot less well known. These are scales that look at measuring suffering, just like they say. They're not as widely used as the Beck or as the STAI, but they're definitely reliable and valid. This article leads you to a whole study where they examine the validity and reliability of the suffering scales. So if you want to get a sense of how do you do a study that looks at those psychometric qualities of reliability and validity, that study would walk you through a pretty good understanding. You'll get that understanding when you watch the 2 other videos, so it's not necessary to do that. But if you want to look at suffering scales and how they did that, and that's cool, then here you go. Another one is called the STAXI, State Trait Anger Inventory, built in large part by the same guy who did the STAI, Spielberger. There are scales on happiness. There are scales on well-being. There's all kinds of scales that look at how you're feeling inside. And I'm going to give you some websites in a minute that will help you find more. Right here. Here are the websites in just the very next slide. And so what I did was I cut and pasted these and put them in the module, because I know you can't click on my lecture and go to these places. But if you go to your module, there's a page with these on it, so then you can use these. Okay, your tests must have reliability and validity. This is detailed in the upcoming 2 videos that are linked right below this lecture in your module. Reliability and validity have to be explained or discussed in your research proposal. So you have to use a measure that has reliability and validity. And then you have to say what those things mean, what that is. So for example, you might say, here's the STAI, it's widely used, it has excellent reliability and validity, and then you have to say more than that. You can't just leave it there. You could use a support statement from one of the measures or from one of the articles that you used, and you're referencing them. You could say this measure has excellent reliability and validity, says Spielberger 1987, something like that. You could say it that way. You could say, for example, split half reliability was, or concurrent validity, or criterion validity. Those terms you're going to learn coming up in the next 2 videos. So today what I've done is helped you understand how to find a measure, what are the basic 3 categories of measures, the importance of using a reliable and valid measure, hopefully gotten you started. If you still don't have a good idea for your research study, or you want to change it, that is fine. Change away. And ways to maybe spark some questions looking at measures. And then you're going to look right now at reliability and validity of measures with these other 2 videos. Okay, so that's what it is for today, and I will see you tomorrow.